Good morning and welcome to Renew Canada's INFRAIntelligence series. My name is Corinne, Lynds and I'm the Content Director here at Actual Media. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion on integrated project delivery. Before we get started, I'll give you a quick tour of the Crowdcast platform so you're able to get as much great information as possible out of today's session. By now, you probably noticed everyone checking in on the right-hand side with the chat feature. Please say hello and let us know who you are and where you're from. Right above the chat, you'll see an Actual Media icon. If you click follow, you'll continue to be updated on our INFRAIntelligence series as new webinars are announced. And down below, you'll see a variety of information. You can see how many people are signed in to today's webinar. You'll see the polls feature where we encourage you to cast your votes. And you also see a little green button with rotating links to the speakers' websites. So be sure to check those out too. And most importantly is the Ask a Question feature. So don't be shy about becoming part of the conversation. I'll do my best to pose your questions to our panelists throughout the discussion. This is our 11th and final INFRAIntelligence webinar of 2021. Last month, our expert panel discussed what's driving electric vehicle infrastructure, and perhaps more accurately, what's needed to encourage adoption and ensure a reliable, widespread charging infrastructure is put in place. If you missed that discussion and you're interested, you can check it out. The recording is available on Renew Canada's events page. Today, we're switching gears to focus on integrated project delivery, or IPD as we more commonly know it. We've got a lot to cover over the next hour, but before I jump in and introduce you to our panel, I'd like to take a few moments to acknowledge the many First Nations and Indigenous people of Canada as the original stewards of this great country. I'm here in Toronto, which is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We all share in the responsibility of our natural infrastructure, and there's much we can learn from the traditional knowledge of the land, water, and materials that allow us to build projects that benefit all Canadians. All right, so let's meet our experts. I'm going to begin by inviting each of our panelists to the screen. Once they're all on screen, I'll have each of them spend just a couple minutes to introduce themselves and quickly tell us a little bit about where they're from, what their role is, and what perspective they're bringing to today's discussion. All right, first up, we have Dick Baer from Colliers Project Leaders.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Team, thank you so much. It's Dick Baer, by the way, but you know, it's
Baer,
one of those
thank you.
German things.
Noted. All right, so let's. I'm going to also invite.
I'm really happy to be here. I have spent the last 18 years working in integrated project delivery.
I'm just going to interrupt you, Dick. I'm going to bring everybody up to the screen first, and then we're going to go around and get
okay.
Okay, sorry to interrupt you. Neal, would you please join us on camera? And Neal is from Graham Construction. Morning,
Hi,
Neal.
everybody.
And then we have Louise Panneton from P1 Consulting. Good morning, Louise. And last but not least, we got Mark Van Buren from the city of Kingston. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody.
Awesome. All right, Dick, now is the time to give us your awesome intro.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's good that you noted it's the awesome one because I started on the other one. But I've been involved in integrated project delivery really since the integrated form of agreement was drafted initially by Will Lichtig. And part of the Lean Construction Institute was the first executive director. And that integrated form of agreement was really drafted because the other contracts available in the market really didn't allow or encourage a lean operating system for both lean design and construction. So that's where we came from, and we've gone quite far in the last 18 years or so. And I've had the great pleasure of working with both Neal and Mark on different projects, and glad to see them here, and I'm meeting Louise for the first time.
Thank you. All right, Neal, you're up next.
All right. Hi. There's an incredible turnout, so thanks for everybody for attending. Hopefully we get some great insight in this hour. Like Corinne said, my name is Neal Panchuk. I've been with Graham Construction for coming up on 9 years now. I'm an architect by training. I spent the first half of my career at Zeidler Architects in Toronto, designing some of the kind of major pieces of Toronto. And it was an interesting insight about 10 years ago when I was on step-sum projects and modified design builds, where the intent for the architect is always to provide what's best for the owner. But in contractual models like that, there isn't the collaboration that we have on IPD. So I found myself sometimes being yelled at by the contractors, sometimes being upset with the consultant, and really not having a proper balance. So there was a time when I kind of said to myself, there's got to be a better way to do business. And Graham literally called me the next day, as kind of out of this kismet, and said, we want to do something different. We're doing an IPD project for University of Waterloo. So I packed my bags and left the architecture industry, moved into construction. So I've been here ever since.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for that. All right, Louise.
Hi, I'm Louise Panneton from P1 Consulting, the owner of the firm that's been around for about 20 years. We've been working in a variety of different collaborative models since then, most recently over the last 5 years in IPD specifically, but embedding collaborative practices in outsourcing, P3s and otherwise. I'm on the board of directors of the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnership, for the Integrated Project Delivery Alliance, and was on the board of directors of the International Facilities Management Association at the international level. So I bring, to the discussion a wide variety of perspectives. We've been involved in procurement, deep procurement for 20 years in the public sector. I noted there's a question about that, a very important part of this methodology, and I look forward to chatting about it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Mark.
Good morning again, everybody. I'm Mark Van Buren. I'm the Deputy Commissioner of Major Projects at the City of Kingston. I've been with the city for almost about 20 years now, and I've seen an awful lot of change here in Kingston over that period of time. I'm trained as a civil engineer and have been involved in delivering a number of projects of varying sizes, but probably none bigger than the current project that we're working on, which is a third crossing. It's a bridge crossing, about a 1.2 kilometer length bridge here in Kingston. And for what we know, it's probably the first linear infrastructure project that has been delivered using integrated project delivery. And we're in the midst of it right now. And I'm happy to join this conversation today because I think, I carry a little bit of maybe a different perspective, and that comes from the owner side. And I appreciate Neal's comments there. We as well had a thirst for looking at things differently. How could we approach, working with consultants and contractors just in a different way? And really at the heart of all of that was collaboration. So look forward for the discussion today.
Thank you so much. All right, let's jump in. All right, so integrated project delivery is a project delivery approach that integrates people, systems, business structures, and practices into a process that collaboratively harnesses the talents and insights of all participants to optimize project results, increase value to the owner, and reduce waste and maximize efficiency. So having said all of that, integrated project delivery is not a brand new concept. So let's begin our discussion today by getting kind of a lay of the land. I'm interested in knowing, are we seeing an increased adoption rate of IPD models? And if so, what's driving that demand? And Dick, I'm going to pick on you first. Can you kick us off? Is integrated project delivery being more widely adopted, or what's driving that from your perspective?
Yeah, it seems like there's almost a wildfire out there now. At least it's in the conversation with most owners. Which was different than when I came up here in 2011 and helped TD Bank with a renovation. That was the first IPD project, I think, in Toronto, but it's kind of coterminous with what was happening back in Moose Jaw. But it was a new concept that came north of the border from the States. And really, the major adoption in the States, interestingly enough, has been hospitals and medical care because it blends so nicely with lean healthcare. But here I think that we have just seen, as Mark pointed out, and he was, one of my first contacts, especially on infrastructure, that owners were looking for something different. They were frustrated with time delays, cost overruns, the kind of inadequacy of what they thought was supposed to be, cost certainty and time certainty. And they just found that fighting with people all the time wasn't that much fun. And I think the variety of projects, from a $6 million project with the Atmospheric Fund that we're working on right now to Neal's project at Ryerson, which is, about $500 million. There's just a huge variety of things in there, and owners seem to be adopting or at least inquiring about it from almost every sector of the industry.
And I think, Corinne, if I could just add to that, the projects are more complex than ever, schedules are tighter than ever, funds are tighter than ever. And the old way of working, where we're throwing information over the fence from one consultant to another and back to the contractor for pricing. It's proved time and time again that's failing, and that's where IPD really comes in and allows us to get out of the gate in an aligned manner right from the start and really drive towards that maximum value.
I think from my perspective, I'm not so sure about the adoption at this point, but I'd say the interest is enormous. I myself get lots of inquiries almost on a weekly basis about, what's going on in Kingston. And, I'd like to learn more about what you guys are doing for IPD. And as Dick said, from an owner's perspective, I think there's a point of getting tired where, you constantly are dealing with projects that are missing budget, missing schedule, and, have the constant looming threat of legal action, between the parties. And it really set the table for how can we do things differently.
And building on that, when you look at the Canadian market, based on the IPDA statistics, there's 50 projects either complete or in progress right now. And that's not even talking about the ones that are in procurement. So, it's active, it's present, and we're definitely seeing a lot more interest in this model. From my perspective, the discussion on risk is one that drives a huge amount of value. Collaborative management of risk, identification of risk, these are big, big benefits of IPD, and I think owners are starting to really rally behind that.
And if I could just jump in and add to that, Louise, thanks for that, because my whole view of IPD is that because it brings everybody to the table up front, we get to know an awful lot more earlier on things we just used to make assumptions on. And so so if risk is just what we don't know, every time we make an assumption, we're assuming something that we don't know. So the more we know earlier, the better we are. And that is right at the top of risk management. And that comes from a guy who used to litigate big construction cases and always wondered, couldn't they have known this before they started that project? It's kind of crazy.
Well, the other thing I'd build on, Dick, on what you're saying is that clarity of scope is also very important. And, ultimately in many of the construction projects, we go out and buy what we expect. In an IPD, we're buying an outcome. We're having good, frank discussions about how it can be done, what we're looking to achieve. So that as well, you look at the balance of the risk and the outcome, and you really do see benefits.
And that's from a procurement perspective on the owner's side. When you're talking risk and outcomes, there were kind of the two camps where there's the procurement department and then there's the people who are actually building and designing along with the team. So procurement departments were saying, well, how do we mitigate risk? How do we do all these things that we can typically think we safeguard ourselves from on a step sum or a DB? And it's this successful projects and events like these where we're actually getting out and explaining to people how you mitigate risk that has allowed those procurement departments to kind of open their ears to IPD in general.
Yeah, building on that, Mark, when you think about it, what you do in a procurement is you balance the outcome risk and the process risk. And so what you're talking about is really focusing in on making sure the process risk is identified without compromising the procurement risk. Though I can tell you there's incredibly great ways to get there.
And that backs into a conversation that was raised in the chat about how you procure IPD teams. So it gets in, many of these projects are in the public space. And Mark's team had to kind of figure out how to procure that team and meet the competitive requirements of the procurement department and the kind of broader public sector issues around procurement. And it's a really interesting discussion because an owner gets interested in it and then they go to their procurement department and they go, oh my goodness, oh, it's gonna be crazy.
And that journey is a long one, but I think it pays off. The time and the effort that is put into that part of the process. With that outcome of finding the best team possible. And I think we all like to think that we're finding the best team, but I really do think we should be asking honest questions of ourselves as to whether or not that investment in preparing good RFP documents and a rigorous process to be evaluating teams We were fortunate to have Dick join us and be part of that evaluation process, a critically important part of the whole IPD journey.
Have you noticed, have the delivery models evolved significantly over the years? And if so, how? I mean, has it been trial and error and people have learning from their mistakes, or has there been other influences?
And maybe I'll jump in here. Having worked on many different models, I think the answer is yes, absolutely. We're seeing more diverse market models in the market, IPD being one of them, but you have progressive DB. There's a lot of different ways to deliver. I mean, part of the contributors, from my perspective, is that the vendor community is becoming a lot more sophisticated and interested in contributing to the outcome. So, they want to be party to the overall structuring of the project, and they bring huge value. So, IPD is definitely driving that. The other one is that there have been a lot of successful delivery models, including P3s, but, it's time to revisit risk, and people are looking at that differently, both in P3s and in this type of approach. So, risk has been a big driver, I'd say, over the last couple of years. We definitely, though, need the right parameters for a project like this.
Yeah, I mean, so I've worked on, I think, 6 different supplemental conditions for the CCDC 30 to match both the procurement and the legal departments of the owners, but also to try to encourage the supply chain. Because, we're going to the market looking for trades, and trades don't usually respond to RFPs. So they don't have like the greatest marketing department. They don't have 20% of their assets tied up in chasing business, because they're usually part of a team with a GC who wins that. And so the supply chain issue is getting people who really understand how the model works and really how that lean operating system works, about plan, do, check, and act, and move forward to best value and effectiveness. That's where those models change a bit to accommodate early adopters in the supply chain.
Yeah, and I think everybody has the same desire, which is certainty. You think about the owner's perspective, the consultant and the contractor's perspective. Everybody has that quest for certainty, and in that journey, you look at risk, and every party is trying to minimize their risk. And I think the evolution that we have seen is that, we've gone from constantly trying to monetize that risk and then trade it away, to flipping that around and saying, well, why don't we actually try to embrace that risk or share that risk? And I think that's the heart of what IPD tries to do, is really just to take that shared risk, shared reward approach. So I do think that is kind of the evolution that we're on right now.
Yeah, being risk averse is like the worst possible. It opens you up. If you're normally risk averse, it opens you up to the greatest number of risks. It's funny how that works as a kind of backwards.
And if we look at like a CM model or design build, something like that, we always I guess take the approach of estimating kind of on the syncopated basis, almost like if you're driving a car, you're always driving with your eyes open. If you close your eyes, you're going to get in an accident. Yet in the AEC world, we think we can keep our eyes closed from a cost perspective for 3 months at a time, and then open them at 30% and go, whoa, just had an accident. Let's turn it around and redo it. And they do it again. So at Graham, we've been pushing the continuous estimating into all our delivery models. Just whether it's asked for it or not, it takes that element of risk and it turns it into days instead of months. And that allows for smaller corrections to be made rather than large scale corrections.
And I think that also underscores the transparency that you see in IPD, because the opacity, if Mark never knows what's really going on with the budget, and he's just waiting to get a budget report every 4 months or something, that's too late to fix it. If you're looking at the budget every week, so Graham at Ryerson is updating numbers every week in a dashboard that everybody has access to. And sometimes those numbers aren't pretty, but it's good to see them, really early, so that you can try to work on them and do something about that.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, it sounds like there have been some challenges, so it leads well into the next question. What would you say the challenges historically have been with IPD models, and how have you overcome them? And I'm happy to have you use examples if you have any to share.
Yeah, I can just jump into that. As the LCI director, the first executive director back in 2010, we just had all these really good ideas and we had no data. And people wanted to go, well, how does it work? How many times have you eaten up all the risk pool? How many times has it gone over? And the owners had to pay. And that's been a big challenge because people believe data more than they believe like great ideas, which is sometimes unfortunate. But we have been able to accumulate a bunch of data. IPDA has done studies. Marku Allison, who is significant in founding that, was on the University of Minnesota study. He worked at the AA when they were developing their models, and so we finally began to develop some data, and that's what helps drive true believers.
Yeah, I think to build on what you're just said, Dick, public sector entities have approval processes, and fitting this model into the approval processes, where you don't have a firm fixed number before you start, which is counterintuitive to begin with. So we need to, and the IPDA is working on developing value for money analysis that compare to the other assessment, on DBB and DB and P3s, so that it becomes a real viable option. The other two areas that I think are challenging under IPD is individuals, because this is all about people, by the way. If you have the right people around the table, your project will be amazing. But slipping back into prior to more traditional behaviors. So embedding those tools so that you're not just doing training at the beginning, but you're going ongoing. And the last from my perspective is, IPD is not designed to have very significant number of changes. It's designed to have a good, solid outcome and collaborative work to get there. So if you don't know what your project is, it's probably not a good candidate for IPD. Understand what you want to buy and build and start. And, projects that have had challenges are some that have, quite significant changes.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I think one of the other obstacles, just to build on Louise's perspective there, is one is just the inherent transparency. This whole notion of people being comfortable with just the idea that consultants and contractors make profit, and then to be able to understand exactly what that profit is, in some circles that makes people feel uncomfortable to be having those discussions with our public, with our residents. These are things that we've always kind of in other models, we obscure. Or we don't talk about it, but it's very transparent and very open, and that's a little bit of a shift in the conversation to be having. I also agree with Louise. There is, that this is all about people and breaking old habits and being open to different approaches to be working together. That's a little bit of a shift. And it requires that constant time and attention to be looking at these things and continuing to learn and improve.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Neal.
It's really a behavior change on everybody's part as well. Like from a planning perspective, site supers, really the best site super was the one who could be the most authoritarian in getting the people to pull to the schedule. And we're reversing that, where the last planners are actually telling the superintendent what the schedule should be. So you look at architects and someone like myself coming from the contractor's field saying, we don't really think we can afford that. How about we look at some other options? And them going, well, why are you telling me how we should be designing? There can be no egos in IPD. That you have to drop your ego at the door and say, I'm looking, we've developed our conditions of satisfaction, our values, and that's what's driving us. It's not the loudest voice in the room.
So when everybody was talking, I was reminded that I think the biggest challenge with IPD is using cost as an input to design. That's a really difficult thing to do. And Mark has to go in front of a city council and has to be able to tell them this is kind of what we think it's going to cost, and this is kind of what it's going to look like. When we haven't designed the building yet, and we don't really know, or the facility or the bridge or whatever, we don't really know what it's going to cost. We're making some guesses around things, without having necessarily a full design. So I think that's a real challenge in getting designers who are so used to designing and pricing, having a really robust estimator at their side or an estimation desk in the big room where they can get information about cost is that's a cultural change that's always a difficult challenge.
Fantastic. We have a question from the audience. Before I ask that question, I'm going to remind everyone to get in there and respond to the poll questions, because we're going to come back to those in a minute. All right, so the question is, for owners who don't typically do mega projects, how do you set them up to be a credible counterparty in IPD when they are sitting across from an established contractor?
So maybe I can jump in, because that's the business we're in. Essentially, we work with owners as a trusted advisor. So, I think what I would say is make sure that you have the expertise at the table with you, who can help navigate you through the process.
Yeah, there's interesting things about mega projects, because people say, well, $500 million project, that's great for IPD, but what about a $10 million project or a $20 million project? We're doing a $6 million project with the Atmospheric Fund, which is heat renewal and renovation on some Toronto community housing projects. And so it changed the way that we approach the IPD. So we went to the market to get an entire IPD team, because we can't afford multiple procurements. We're looking at how that team is going to function kind of on the interior, because it's such a limited project, and yet it's a pilot project for doing a whole bunch of these things down the road. So we spent 6 months working with 9 different legal firms on the supplemental conditions, because it's a real way of kind of testing it. But I do think it is that IPD is available for almost every kind of project if the owner is willing to participate at a different level than they have in the past.
And I think that is probably one of the important ingredients in looking at IPD is that extent to which the owner is involved. And it was one of, I think, the points of consideration that we gave, and we had that discussion with our city council around, what was going to be the most suitable procurement model for our project. And I think one of the things was, not diminishing the value that we as the owner could bring to the discussion. In this case, our project, it started its journey in 2009. So you can imagine, the years of discussions with stakeholders and the public and regulatory agencies, and there's a value that can be unlocked from that the owner has that they can bring to the rest of the team. So, for the audience, I think that is one of the considerations that should be given, is what is the value that the owner can bring to the table, and not discounting that.
And it's even what value can the owner bring, and how do they define value? We're trying not to make decisions in the absence of input from the owner, simply because it's not our money. It's the stakeholders' money. So I've worked with Dick a couple of times now, and that's really the benefit of getting an advisor in early to help educate them prior to getting an RFP or something like that out, so they can quantify in their brain, what am I actually looking for as an end state, to what Louise said. Because we're not mind readers. We can't provide that for you. You need to help us determine what value is, and we can collectively move forward.
Just building on what Mark said, I think it's really interesting when you think about the owner's role and the owner as a participant, not a recipient of the service. I mean, in one of the projects we were involved in at CNL, getting through the security gate is a big, huge deal. And normally in a traditional project, the owner would say, well, that's your problem, figure it out, schedule your deliveries according to my availability. in an IPD, you work together and say, is there a better way for us to do it? Can we keep the gates open an extra hour? Can we, so it becomes a lot more collaborative, but the owner is a stakeholder. An owner has part of all of the benefit, but a lot of the action as well. So it's a really important point, Mark. Thanks for bringing it up.
And we have an opportunity to define, what those roles are. One of the important ingredients in IPD is the validation phase. And that is that opportunity for the team to really say, okay, who is going to take the lead? Who is going to play in the supporting role as we think and parse through all of these elements of our project? So definitely, owner is listed up there as, tasks 1 through 100 in terms of our leadership and contribution to the team.
And it changes how owners look at projects. I'm reminded of my friend Angela Presta coming into the big room at Humber saying, we got a big problem with the fire hydrant and I'm so happy. And everybody went, well, why are you happy? He said, because yesterday that was my problem. Today, it's our problem. And it's an interesting way of addressing what IPD really does in mindset change.
This might be the most quotable panel ever. All right, I'm going to jump to another question. All right, let's see. So a major drawback of IPD is that the price isn't set in a competitive environment, but it sounds like IPD can drive better value through a collaborative process. Can you talk about how IPD can lead to good VFM for owners?
Maybe I can start with that. It's definitely one of my passions, working on value for money. So number one, you do have competition and you have open book as it relates to the poly-party partners. So, you end up seeing exactly what their compensation is. And, you have the opportunity to challenge, by the way, not alone as the owner, but with the remainder of the team on whether or not what's being put forward is reasonable. So, in my opinion, there's actually more, maybe less competition, but more challenging of the actual true cost. The other is, there's a number of commodity trades that are involved in here in which you will run procurements or have some competition. So, there is a good balance of that. We also recommend having quantity surveyors come in and validate some of these costs as you go along. So, there's a number of checks and balances that will demonstrate that you are indeed getting value for money in the same way as you would through a competitive process.
Yeah, I would underscore that completely because I think there's a huge amount of competition, actually. It's just not always competition about price. So there is competition about rates and overhead and the different things that you bring to the table. But the real competition is between the teams. What team is bringing the most value? Who has the best understanding of things? That's why the interview becomes usually a much more highly scored part of the overall process than just price alone. And as Louise said, I think we find about 30% of the contracts are lump sum that are competed on price because they're very fungible. You would never, you'd never sit down and interview a box of nails for an hour to decide which one was best, right? You would just look at the price and you would just go buy those box of nails. So there's, I think, Neal, you can back me up on this experience. My experience is about 30% of the overall contracts are lump sum.
Yep, that's where we found it as well. And it like on a monthly basis, we're still looking at resource loaded work plans, which is essentially capturing from the start of the project to the end of the project what the resourcing is from each trade, each consultant, and measuring that against our progress for the project. So it's really keeping our eyes open, like I mentioned before, and the PMT, the project management team, really making sure that we're recognizing on a regular basis, what is this person doing? What is this team doing? Can we make adjustments to things like that? So to Dick's point for the best value piece, we certainly may not be the most inexpensive team, but we're using every hour at its optimal value. So in the end, to Louise's point, for the outcome you're getting, it is less expensive. You're paying more in some areas, but it's overall less expensive at the end because we're aggregating the elements of the whole in such a unique way that it brings that value.
And where normal lump sum contracts go up, After you open the bid, you're bound to get change orders that are going to increase things, because that's how people have bid it, to be able to make those change orders. And what happens when you pick your IPD team and you set it on a target cost, it really, in 98% of the cases, it never gets worse than that. That's the amount that you're going to pay. The profit's at risk for the team. And as you move through it, there's not change orders unless there's some substantial, you're building a parking lot next door. Finding something in the middle of the lawn is not a change order.
And just to build on Louise's first comments there, I mean, this is, in terms of the value for money, I mean, I'd like for people not to mistake that, this just doesn't go into a black hole where, one party makes all the decisions. We as the owner are involved in every single procurement decision, that happens on the project. Certainly we're not going to be sitting there, and as Dick said, we're not going to spend a day, discussing, whether or not we're going to buy a box of screws from Home Depot or Rona, but other major procurements, there is always a good, healthy discussion about, evaluating the different subcontractors that are going to be involved, who brings that value, what is the price, and we're doing that as a team. It's not just one entity that has that responsibility.
I'd like to come back to Neal's point about, the value, and, many of the procurements, in the past were really focused in on a race to the bottom line. Who can do it the cheapest, lowest cost compliant, all of these types of models. My comment to you is you get what you pay for. So, at the end of the day, under this model, and, tying back to what Neal said, what we're looking for are the best and the brightest to come to the table. And maybe it'll take them 2 hours instead of 10 hours to do something. So, that's the kind of value that you look at under this. And the full transparency really helps you get there. So quite beneficial.
I've always thought that price competition was, in fact, just a zero-sum game, right? That it was always based on the idea that we might be able to get something for less than it costs. And I can tell you, in the 50 years I've been lawyering and doing this kind of thing, you never get anything for less than it costs.
Fair enough. We have another question here related to cost. If you don't know how much a project will cost at the outset, how do you get approval for it to proceed? I think that's jumping off a comment was made earlier.
Oh yeah, that's great. So I'll just jump in really quickly. The reason you have a validation period is to try to figure out what the building should cost, or the facility should cost, what the bridge should cost. And then the team makes a leap of faith that they can deliver it for less than that expected cost. So you're doing a really deep dive into what's available out there, whether it's benchmarking or estimation or flying through the model, or as Neal said, continuous estimating or conceptual estimating. You have so many more data points than you do in a usual just low cost bid. So I think the validation period is hugely important, and it's often a pretty difficult journey for folks, which brings out the best talent in people.
And to add in, I mean, it's also an off-ramp for the parties as well. If the journey through validation just points to the fact that, you can't put the round peg in the square hole, you're just not going to be able to build your project for your budget, there's the off-ramp there. So again, that investment in doing a proper validation phase and coming up with that final report, not only gets you, past that hurdle, but it also becomes a great guiding document, as you carry on through your journey in detailed design and construction.
Yeah, and you have the people who are actually going to do the work at the table, setting these dollar values with you. It's not a theoretical exercise that's being done in isolation of how it can be done or when it can be done. So that, that drives a lot of value in terms of the certainty of the numbers as well. So it's an important piece.
Yeah, and I think part of the question seemed to be that how do you establish a budget even before you get to the IPD or the start of validation? So as Graham, we have owners coming to us all the time looking to establish kind of high level budgets of what their project can cost. So we welcome anybody to come to us. We'll talk with them, try to set that initial budget for the incorporation into the kind of RFP to set that with your procurement, things like that.
Yeah, I did mention, that we usually engage quantity surveyors through the entire process, and that starts at the beginning and stays with the project throughout. It does provide owners and their executive a lot of assurance too, both on the buildup of the numbers themselves and that they're realistic and defendable. So it's
what we've done on Ryerson is, and this was really with Neal's suggestion and the suggestion of the core group, was to do an early audit. So we have some early auditors who come in and just say, okay, these rates look reasonable. This overhead looks reasonable. This is a value check against what the market is. So it's another thing that you can do.
Yeah.
Right. All right, let's take a quick look at our polls and see what the feedback from our crowd here is today. So the first question of the polls is, have you participated in a project that used IPD? And only 23% of our attendees today have, and then we got 76% no. So a lot of people here, I think, to learn a lot more about it. So this is great. And then what do you perceive as the greatest benefit of participating in an IPD project? So the perception here is 68%, or I believe it's the collaboration innovation. Just 10% see it for efficiencies and cost savings, and then only 21% for lower risk. For our panel, would you agree with these? Is anything here?
I like the one about the efficiency and cost savings. Just similar to what Dick was talking about. The reason to get into an IPD project is to believe in collaboration, innovating, and driving to value. It's not to race to the bottom line, like Louise said. So if you have a project that you think is over budget and the timeline you can't make the timeline, don't choose IPD because it's going to solve that. It's not a panacea. It's going to help maximize that or best suit it, but you really don't be looking at a miracle cure for your ills.
So where IPD saves you money, really, because I think this goes right to what Neal is talking about. We're trying to take out those processes that are misaligned around litigation and making a record so that you can sue somebody later on. So the whole submittal process and how much that costs you. In IPD, we typically pick an air handler in design. So we don't have that whole, long extended period. We don't have change orders. So we don't have those administrative costs. And what you're really trying to get to is absolute zero on cost. But you got to remember that stuff costs money. and this is not, somebody said to me the other day, oh, I thought IPD gives you all the value that you want for the money you have. And I said, no, what IPD tells you is what's the value you can get for the money you have. It doesn't give you all the value that you want, because that's like Christmas, and that would be awesome. Christmas, everybody.
That's awesome. The last question, or last poll question we had was, what do you perceive as the greatest challenge of participating in an IPD project? And I love this based on the fact that a lot of our audience today hasn't been in one yet. So it's good to see the perception. So trust isn't automatic. So 20% are, not sure about working with the partners, perhaps. Higher upfront costs came in at only 7%. Greater time commitment is only 2%. And then the big one here at 69.2% is not everyone is familiar with IPD. So I think that kind of aligns with what we were saying right off the top in terms of it still being something that people are getting to know. And although it's growing, I think there's still lots to learn. We have had lots of great questions here. This is amazing.
If I could just add, I would encourage those who are taking the poll to actually go to the IPDA site. There's lots of tools, lots of information, lots of training. So if you want to learn about IPD, it's a really good place to start. And, know you're not alone. There's a lot of people in the learning curve right now and interested in the process.
I think John Tenpenny, the editor of Renew Canada, will likely post that link in the chat in just a minute. So
I think Corinne, I think, the learning is an important part of the whole process here. And it's not just learning individually. I think it's also, if the decision is made to pursue an IPD project, is learning as a team. In fact, Dick was with us as we did some of those sessions where we brought, owner, consultant, contractor together. And it was really important to go through that process. And I think it laid the foundation for some other important pieces here, which is, setting out mission statement, setting out your project values, setting out your goals. And some of these things actually become part of your validation exercise where you're going to attach financial compensations to goals So, this doing this learning in a joint way, to really establish that strong foundation for the project, and then you keep building on that. The team learning, manifests into just spending more time together in that collaboration, and it takes time and it takes energy. But at the end of the day, I think it builds what we all look for, which is trust. And once you get to that point where you believe that you've established some good trust amongst the team, then I think you really start to unlock a whole lot of these efficiencies and that creative thinking that comes through that kind of day-to-day collaboration.
Perfect. So I know last week when we were chatting amongst ourselves as a group, we had one topic that elicited a little bit of debate, which was which projects are ideal for an IPD model, and how do you decide which model to use? Which projects for which models? And I think this will answer some of the other questions that will be coming up too, because there's questions specific to mining and other other things too. Anyone here like to start out? I know both Dick and Louise had some comments on this.
Sure. So I'd love to start out because, I spent 30 years just litigating contracts, construction contracts and securities contracts that had hundreds of thousands of documents and stuff. And so from my perspective, the way that we designed the IFOA inside the lean community to use a lean operating system is really, in my view, the IPD is just the contract model that enables the system. And the system works on almost every project. Now, you might have timelines, you might have political restrictions, you might have other things inside your procurement that makes it difficult for you to do. But if you just think about the lean design and construction system, and that's the operating system, it really does work really well in almost any design or build project from my perspective.
Yeah, and maybe I can add on to that with a little bit of a different perspective. I'm a big believer in IPD, but not for every project. Some of the clients we work with, like, for example, large government entities, have a big bulk of their projects that really should be developed through design bid build or DB, like really get the work done, small projects, low risk. Where the model should be used is, number one, where you have the right team. I mean, that's test number one. Actually, it's my test. As we start looking at projects, will you have the right people at the table to actually carry this project through and have the right attitude? Number two is really right governance, the approval process. Have you figured out how to move your project through the entire approval process? And do you have the approval and endorsement from the executive? Very, very important as you're considering this project, probably more so than a traditional project, because you're selling them on the concept as well as the project itself. The second, and we talked about it earlier on, the right support. Legal and procurement are huge stakeholders in these projects. We need to engage them, train them, have them participate through the entire process. If you've got a procurement department or a legal department that's not going to embrace this process, it just ain't going to work. And then finally, from my perspective, I've said it a couple of times, the right project. You really have to know what you're going to buy, and you don't need it spec'd out. Absolutely not. That would in fact be the wrong project. You need to know what the outcome is and have a clear vision. Your contractor and designer aren't going to figure that out for you. You have to figure it out. So those are for me the tests on whether or not a project would be successful.
All right.
I think I would agree with that, Corinne, is that, I think from an owner's perspective, if you know exactly what you buy and it's been done 20 times over, you probably have a different contractual model that suits that. I think, where there are projects that involve a level of complexity, multiple stakeholders, and I mentioned it earlier, is the long history, that allows for an environment where the owner can bring some of that knowledge as value to the project, then I think it's more appropriate, sitting in an IPD world.
Yeah, I think this dovetails with the question that Phil raised in the chat about smaller or less experienced development teams and how do you support them. And so, I recently sold my company to Colliers project leaders, because they do a pretty, nationwide job of advising people as trusted advisors like Louise on how to develop what's best for their projects. But the cool thing about bringing me in is that they have now, that's in some senses a kind of a market recognition that, we also need to be able to help owners with this whole IPD process, because it looks pretty simple on paper, but I think, at base, from my perspective, it's not about the contract. The contract is actually, it doesn't really tell you much. It sets up a PMT, it tells you need to collaborate, and it gives you some schedules. If you don't have a lean operating system to actually make that effective, you're almost like a CM not at risk, right? You're just kind of moving through the project as you normally would without changing those behaviors. And to Neal's point, when you're managing your resources, you have to be able to tell people that they need to go home, right? You have to be able to say, you're not adding value right now. And that's a difficult thing for how the industry has usually supported projects and teams.
Yeah. And I think for any owners out there who are concerned about the size of their project they don't think is large enough, there are a lot of instances where with post-secondary institutions and things like that, where there are multiple small projects going on concurrently throughout the campus, it can certainly be packaged into a larger piece so we can get one design team moving on different projects. We can use workable backlog to make sure that we're maximizing value for labor that's on site. So there are a lot of unique options that can happen.
Great. All right, I think we'll have time for at least one more question from the audience here. Please comment, how does IPD apply to large, like 1 billion projects, like building a new mine? Overruns for mine projects are notoriously excessive and ending in legal actions.
So we're involved in a project that is IPD, I'll call it IPD-ish. It's a target cost model for Canadian nuclear laboratories, and very complicated, a lot of influencing factors. And what I can tell you is the benefits of collaboration between the contractor in this case and the client are extremely significant. So what occurred in the project is a clear definition of the risks and a quantification of those risks up front. And by the way, establishing mitigants right out of the gate. Let's figure out what we're going to do when this happens. So, in very large, very complex projects, thinking out not only, what do I want at the end of it, but what happens when things go wrong, because they will go wrong. There are things that will go wrong. There are extremely big benefits, and we get that with IPD as well. So, I think it's that's what I would say is one of the contributors that will help put your project in place on time, on budget.
And really, one of the earliest IPD project, public IPD projects, was the California Prison Healthcare Receivership that was done back in 2008. That was a $7 billion program to build 10,000 beds in California prisons as quickly as possible. And when the economy fell apart in 2008, 2009 in the States, the team went out and did one of those projects, and they did it in 23 months. And I have a little plaque on my wall that says we delivered $60 million worth of construction in a single month. So there are huge benefits. We're doing big, giant projects in a collaborative fashion. It just takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of thinking, it takes a lot of complication. And I think it's the most agile process for dealing with the things that Louise said. Things are going to come up, things are going to go wrong. What do you do?
Yeah, and it's part of the IPD facilitates it well. It's the lean principles that go into construction. And if we keep having recurring overages in something like a mine, we need to remedy that, not by adding litigiousness to the contract to protect yourself from risk. We need to accept that those are happening, dig into them, do the root cause prior to the project starting and at the project start, to say, these are every single, or these are all the reasons why we keep going over on projects. Let's dig into it now before it hits us later.
And Mark is here as an example of a guy who thought, well, it'd be cool to do a construction project differently. Let's do a bridge. And I think it's the first bridge we've done in Canada on an IPD basis. One of the very few bridges that have been done. Now with this $1 trillion infrastructure stuff going on in the States, and that will lead to both resource shortages in Canada, steel shortages, all kinds of different things. We have to be able to think about this as a flexible, agile way of delivering projects.
Yeah, I'd be interested in the question and kind of dissecting that a little bit more in terms of, what are the circumstances that are creating these issues with mining projects. I might venture that, part of this is just regulatory approvals, in dealing with, regulatory agencies. And even in our experience, that has been difficult. And it is something to consider, even as we think about the evolution of IPD, and how do we improve upon this model. I for one think that there is an opportunity that we're finding this level of collaboration between owners and consultants and contractors, but how do we create an environment in which we can bring the regulatory bodies to the table as well, to really capitalize on some efficiencies, and maybe that's the journey ahead as we think creatively about how we can do that.
What's interesting is one of my colleagues, Carla Sapliski, is working with the city of Lloydminster, and they recently won a red tape reduction award because they started with a water treatment facility and they moved into how the city operates and their tax assessment process and their trash collection process. And she's helping them lean up all of those different things. And it goes right to what you're saying, Mark, that these processes help us in so many different ways.
Yeah, and I think just capitalizing on the maintainability as well. I think, Mark, that's a really good point. Think not only about what you're building, what you're maintaining, how you're, and that is an area that can have a lot of benefit up front as well.
The cool working with Dick on Trafalgar Park, and to Mark's point, we actually brought in the site plan approval committee as well as the building officials for permits to have them plan with us. They weren't comfortable doing it because we were trying to say, how long does it take? And we did it over and over and ended up saving a substantial amount of time. And really, it was our time in submitting things in the correct order and basically how they want it. Because you can't just go to the City of Toronto website and they spell out exactly the order you need to submit. They tell you, here, this is what you need. So it's a bit of an art to figure that out. So just welcome them in and they become part of the process.
Yeah. Well, what's great about Mark's project is that he had done that 10 years of regulatory work before we started the project. And we end up on projects all the time. And Neal, the one that you're on now, where people are going for site plan approval and they're going for rezoning and they're doing all kinds of administrative stuff. And no matter how quickly we go, we're hidebound by what those milestones are.
Yeah.
We have just a couple minutes left. And there was another question about IPD training. And I was wondering if our panel could make any recommendations for people who are looking to learn more about IPD. Where would you recommend they start?
Well, again, I'll mention the IPDA. Lots of material there, lots of tools available. There's an IPD boot camp that's happening this summer. So, and there's owners forums, lots of places for you to get involved and learn about IPD through the organization.
Yeah, there's a couple that I would mention, leanconstructionblog.com. Lots of educational papers and different things there, and they're creating a Lean 101. And then I would point to the Lean Construction Institute in the States, who publish a number of books. They have a Congress every year. They have a design forum. There's lots of great learning that goes on there as well.
Yeah, and if owners are looking for kind of the basics to get a bit more understanding, I regularly speak to owners from a contractor side and bring them up to speed on how it works. So feel free to get in contact.
Yeah, likewise. Always happy to talk about this.
Mark, do you know if there's a place where owners can talk to other owners to kind of get that perspective as well?
Corinne, I don't think that there's anything that I know. Louise had mentioned earlier the IPDA. I think that's a great body that's come together. But I think we're in the infancy here. An awful lot of this is doing what you are doing today, which is to host a panel like this. And I think we're going to find that it's a pretty small group of people. And so, I think anybody on this panel would be more than happy that if people want to reach out and have a conversation, more than happy to entertain and spread the word and at least tell you what we know, maybe more about what we don't know.
There's actually, there is an owners forum and the Lean Construction Institute in the States. That was designed specifically so owners could go in there and share their problems in confidence with other owners.
Yeah, same for IPDA, same thing. There's an owners forum as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much to all of you today. You've probably been the easiest panel I've ever had to moderate. Just kind of flowing along. It's fabulous. And lots of great questions from the audience too. I would be remiss if I didn't thank today's sponsor, Graham Construction. We wouldn't be able to host important discussions like this one today without the generous support of our industry. And also a big thank you goes out to all of our attendees. Your participation through the chat feature and the poll questions really drives a level of intimacy for these that we would not be able to achieve otherwise. So thank you. This was the last INFRAIntelligence webinar of 2021, but have no fear, we'll be back in 2022 with a full lineup of webinar topics addressing Canada's most pressing infrastructure trends, challenges, and opportunities. Before we part ways, I have one last announcement I'm excited to share with you. Starting in the new year, INFRAIntelligence webinars will also be available as downloadable podcasts. So if you follow Actual Media up at the top of your screen, you'll automatically get notifications for the latest information on upcoming webinars and where to download podcasts as they become available. So thank you again, stay safe, and we will see you in the new year.